All right. MOvember, day, what is it? Day 16, I think. I've done a few writing projects, so I haven't done a film for a couple of days. But tonight I've come fresh from a group, and then a private session where I'm working with someone through this book. So I thought tonight I wanted to talk about Breaking Free, which was the workbook that went with this book, called Facing Codependence. Now, just like when you refer to a movie and it makes you sound old, the older the movie is, well, these books make a therapist sound old, and I don't care. When Pia Mellody wrote these books, she was really flying by her experiential pants, and her story is at the beginning of this book, and she talks about her own journey with sobriety, and then after she got sober, she had so much relational difficulty in the workplace that she nearly got fired as the director of nursing, and her story is best read in this book. And they sort of basically said, look, if you can't deal with your rage, then you won't be able to attend meetings, and as the director of nursing of a facility, a treatment facility, she knew what that meant she was fired. She'd even gone off to rehab to try and deal with it and realised that they didn't really know how to cope. And she told them that she was a lesbian because she knew that they wouldn't be able to cope with that either, so they just ignored her, and she got through treatment and went back, and she had an epiphany. She realised that that what got the alcoholics clean was telling their stories. So she told people to, as she writes, to the admin people or the nurses, anyone that comes in and says that they've got trauma, send them to her. Well, she started to talk about her experience with trauma, and then they started to tell their story, and she started to develop techniques, and those techniques become one-on-one sessions, and then she was so busy she couldn't do a job, so she said, give me a lecture, and then the lecture turned into a workshop, because, you know, and in the end, the rest is history. But this is the book I want to talk about. The neuroscientist Dan Siegel says that one of the most distinguishing factors that breaks generational trauma being passed on from one to the other is that if you can get your story straight. Now, Pia wrote this book before The Body Keeps the Score, before somatic experiencing. She wrote this book just out of experience, her model. I went over that earlier, so I'm not going to go over the model tonight, but what I wanted to do was just read the introduction page. I just see people in recovery devastated, and they think that sometimes they're doing something wrong, or they're not working the program hard enough, or they relapse, or they get sober in one addiction and not in others. And you know, Patrick Carnes, who runs a General Path program and has done amazing work from Out of the Shadows onwards, and talks about you know, if you've got one addiction, that you've got 87% chance of having two or more. Now, we know now with addiction, because it's the reward center of the brain that was impacted, but we also now know that it's the way the brain is impacted due to developmental trauma that leaves us vulnerable for that reward system to be taken over. But I wanted to read this. She wrote this in '89. She said, this workbook is for people who want a self-help tool to assist in their recovery from codependence. She goes on to say, I wrote this workbook to help people work through the initial sense of overwhelming devastation that often comes when they first become aware of the disease of codependence. And what I would say is that they become aware of their adverse childhood experiences. I believe that at least 4 factors cause these overwhelming feelings. 1, the sheer number of symptoms identified as stemming from the disease. 2, the beginning awareness of how the disease got set up and adapted to childhood experiences that were less than nurturing. This new awareness is especially crushing when the defenses used to protect yourself from the reality of what happened to you start to fail and reality hits home. Now, this is when people, their addiction stop, you know, their addictive behaviors or chemicals stop working for them. And so this pain keeps coming up, this implicit fear and dread and doom keeps coming up. Their flashbacks increase and they can't get over the top of it with addiction. In actual fact, when people get sober, it's not uncommon to hear that when they give up their addiction, whatever it was, that they now feel suicidal because it was the thing that was sort of regulating them, even though it was a dangerous behaviour. The third thing is the realisation of the scope of the problem, how extensively the issues are affecting your life. And the fourth one is interesting because she says the seemingly slow progress you make in recovery, largely because much of the progress you make is hidden by denial or minimised. Now, when childhood trauma happens, we have, especially under 7, we have this organic nature to suppress, repress, and then disassociate away from what is perceived as life-threatening situations for children. As an adult, as we distance ourselves through our adaptations, defense mechanisms, and these cognitive distortions, we go into minimizing what happened to us. We go into denial about what happens to us, which just means I know it happened, but I'm just going to tell you it didn't happen. I'll make up another story. Delusion about what happens, which means that we now actually believe that other story. And then there's memory loss. It's not uncommon for people that disassociated away from what they felt was life-threatening trauma and abuse and neglect and abandonment to experience memory loss in their adult life. And it's not uncommon, therefore, when people start to give up their addictions, the way they medicate, that all of a sudden, through relational engagement and interaction, that these memories start to come back. And that can be really overwhelming. But she goes on to say here, the fourth factor is curious and very important. Conducting life in the disease. So conducting life in the immaturity, the impact, the less than, better than, too vulnerable, invulnerable, bad and flawed, good and perfect or rebellious, too needy or needless and wantless, out of control and in control, what Dan Siegel calls the rigidity, and then the chaos and the window and tolerance in the middle. She says here that as you work at recovery, it's easier to be in the disease than it is to be functional. Being functional, acting in your own best interest, feels awful, shameful, as though you're doing something wrong. In recovery, you begin to see that what you thought was normal is actually dysfunctional, and you begin to notice yourself thinking, feeling, and acting dysfunctional in dysfunctional ways a lot. You learn to operate in this normal but dysfunctional way in childhood. Like when people grow up with addiction, they learn not to see it. When you grow up in dysfunction, you just think it's normal. You have been acting this way a long time and will find yourself continuing because it is your standard operating procedure all along. This awareness is part of the process of recovery, and this book was designed to help you start to recover and to work against the experience of being overwhelmed and in denial, delusion, or minimizing regarding your own recovery. So if you're out there and you're really struggling in recovery, then I really enjoyed like using this book to run groups, because it's in 3 sections. The first section is looking at what happened to you very graphically and getting your story straight, as Dan Siegel says. Looking to the emotional states and the body physical sensation states, somatic sort of data. The second part is then looking at, well, look, how do we go on then, now with living in these 2 extremes, and how do we sabotage our own lives by now acting this out on others, by either acting in that wounded self or that adult adapted self in the ways I went through it, that they impact people. We go, the negative control, the resentment and rage, the spiritual crisis leading to dishonesty, the need because we're too needy and act needless and wantless and end up with addictions, mental health issues, and physical health issues that impacts grossly on all our relationships. So the second part, she says, look, for essentially, we are powerless now over ourselves, the way that we have complex post-traumatic symptoms, the way we've got cognitive distortions and defenses, the way we've got this inability to feel in a healthy and adult appropriate way, and then these choices of behaviours that can sometimes be addictions or behavioural cover-ups because it's just too painful to be who we are. So she says, look, we essentially are powerless over ourselves and our life becomes unmanageable, and she uses the 12 steps to really debrief and work through how codependency lives itself out. Call it developmental trauma, call it adverse childhood experience, it doesn't matter. The symptoms are the same. The last part of the book is really interesting because she really grows and develops that functional adult. She says essentially that recovery is about two recoveries. One is from our addictions and mental health issues, and the other is from our history. And so in recovery, it's our job now to sort of turn up, become present, mindful, and then grow up. Not in that shaming way you might have been told as a kid to grow up. It's appropriate now that as an adult man, I need to stand up and grow up and manage and look after that wounded part of myself of the complex post-traumatic stress, and the part of me that adapted but is immature in the way I take care of myself. It's a big job, and it takes a village to raise a child. And I think that phrase is really apt for people that are reparenting themselves. It takes a village. It takes a sponsor, a good therapist, a good therapy group, good peers and mentors, people that are willing to take this journey with you. There's so much to be gained. The work that Dan Siegel's doing about the sort of the we, the I, the you, the we, where our parasympathetic nervous system is engaging, and we learn to affect regulate each other, and just through being mindful and present. After Christmas, I'm going to run a Breaking Free group. I've decided it. I love this book. I know some of you out here there that are friends of mine on Facebook and LinkedIn. Right, I love this book as well. If you want to do it again, come and do it again. But if you're really struggling, look it up online. And it's on Amazon. You can get them cheap. This is the book that started it. She's written other things since then, and she's working on a book on spirituality now. But essentially, I hope tonight has been just another. This MOvember for me is about trying to reach out MOvember is about men and men's health, and I usually focus on mental health. But let's face it, we're all in this together. We're on a planet plummeting through the universe. None of us get out here alive. So anyone out there that's sort of suffering and wants to know more about how to stop sabotaging your life with that suffering, please personal message me. I'm happy to sort of answer any questions. This stuff means a lot to me. So take care and have a good night. Bye-bye.